Hello there and welcome to this video on the BRK XR series of rifles. In this video we're going to be detailing the disassembly process as well as giving you any information you need as we walk through the procedure. Before we start, this particular video is going to be on the Sniper XR, although the information given in this video will also be relevant to the other XR models. The only differences are the stock options, the barrel length options and also the bottle options. The BRK XR Ranger, Atomic, Sniper, Commander and the Concept all share the same block. However, when the disassembly procedure significantly changes, we will bring in these components and detail the disassembly process of the individual components for the rifle. With that all said and out of the way, on your screen now will be a complete tool list of all the tools that we're going to use in order to carry out this disassembly procedure. It includes all the Allen key sizes, all the spanner sizes, and finally any BRK specific tooling required for the job. Right then, with that all said and done, we can begin on the disassembly. First thing we're going to do is remove the stock. We're going to do that by flipping the rifle up and then using a 5mm Allen key to remove the stock bolt. With the stock removed, we can put this nice and safely over to one side. Now, the removal of the stock is slightly different between the different versions of the rifle. For example, on the Atomic and the Ranger rifles, you simply need to remove these 4 screws here using a 2.5mm Allen key. This will allow this aluminium housing to be removed and put safely to one side. The Commander stock is slightly different again. To remove this stock from the action, we need to first use an Allen key or a small flat-bladed screwdriver to pop up this cap here, remove this plastic spacer, then in the base of the grip there we see a bolt. We need to loosen this using a 5mm Allen key, and that will allow us to remove the grip, and then we can remove this plastic housing from the action. Next thing we're going to do is cock the rifle. Remove any single shot loader or magazine present in the action, and then fire the rifle into a nice safe backstop. What this will do is make sure that the rifle is unloaded and safe to work on. Next thing we're going to do is degas the rifle. Before we do that though, we are just going to take a look at this gauge here and note the current set reg pressure. On our rifle, it's just over the 80 bar mark, so I'm going to make a note of that, and then when we rebuild the rifle, we can reset the reg to this point. Once we've noted down our regulator set pressure, we can use a 22mm spanner just to crack the gauge loose. After about a turn or two, the gauge should start to leak air. Once the hissing stopped, we can take another look at the gauge, make sure both gauges are reading 0, and then to make double sure we can cock the rifle, fire it and make sure no air comes out the end of the barrel. Once that's been done, we can remove the gauges. Both of these gauges here have a Doughty washer seal on the base of them, and if air is leaking from around the gauge area, you simply need to replace the Doughty washer seal. With that said, the degassing procedure for the cylinder rifles is slightly different. What we need to do is remove this front cap here, like so, by just pulling it off. Then we can use the same 22mm spanner to crack the gauge loose on the front of the cylinder. Once the air has leaked out the end of the cylinder, we need to dry fire the rifle in a nice, safe direction to make sure there's no air residue left inside the valve housing. Next thing we'll do is just unscrew the bottle to make the rifle a little easier to handle. The bottle does have a seal on the front here, and if this seal has failed or is leaking, air will be leaking out of the bottle and the block join. So there's the O-ring there. With that done, the next thing we'll do is remove the pick rail, and that's simply done by loosening these 5 screws using a 3mm Allen key. Next up, we can remove the shroud and the barrel from the block. To remove the shroud, we'll simply unscrew it, and then pull it off of the barrel. Next, we'll remove the barrel from the block by simply removing these 2 grub screws here. And that's done using a 2.5mm Allen key. The barrel itself has 3 O-rings on it, so 2 external ones and 1 internal one. The internal one seals around the pellet probe, And if this O-ring is leaking, you'll feel a small puff of air every time you take a shot. The same goes for the two external O-rings, these two here. If either of these are leaking, when you take a shot you'll feel a small puff of air emanating from the breech area. On the barrel itself we have two other things we can remove. We have the back carrier for the shroud. This can be removed by using a 2.5mm Allen key to loosen these two grub screws here. With those loose, the back carrier for the shroud can be slid off the barrel. We also have the shroud carrier at the front here. This can be removed using a set of snap ring pliers, coming in the end there, then unscrewing it. Now these are done up quite tightly from the factory and are normally secured using blue Loctite, so just be aware of that if you end up needing to take this off. And there we have it there. The next thing we'll remove is the trigger plate and trigger guard. To do that we're going to remove these four screws here using a 2.5mm Allen key. As you remove these screws, just be aware that under this screw here, so this one here, there is a small spring and a plunger. This is used to control the power adjuster on the side of the rifle. So just be aware of those two things there. With that removed, we can just pull the power adjuster out the side, and this has two O-rings around it, one at the front there and one at the back. If either of these need replacing, there will be a small puff of air emanating from the side of the rifle, so either on this side here or on this side here. And I'll just give you a quick close-up of the small spring and the plunger that comes out of this hole here. So this one in the bottom of the block. If we need to, we could disassemble the trigger housing a little further. To begin with, we'll remove this plastic cover by just using a 3mm Allen key to remove the screw at the front and the back. And then if we need to remove the safety, we do so by removing the two grub screws, so one on the side there and then one on the top. So to begin with, we'll remove the one on the top, being nice and careful as there is a ball bearing and a spring that's held captive by this grub screw here. So as you remove that, just be very careful not to lose the ball bearing and then the spring in the bottom. So there, them two pieces are there. Next thing we'll remove is this grub screw in the side of the safety, again using a 1.5mm Allen key. With those two grub screws removed, we can remove the safety unit and put that safely to one side. Next up, we'll remove the front bottle connection. To begin with, we'll loosen the two grub screws in the front here, so one on this side in this hole here, one on this side in this hole here. We're going to do that with a ball-ended 2.5mm Allen key, just loosening them a couple turns. With the grub screws loose, we can then rotate this front block and unscrew it from the main block. There we have it. With the cylinder guns, the disassembly procedure is slightly different, so I'll detail that now. With the cylinder installed, the first thing you need to do is unscrew the cylinder from this back housing here. This will be held captive in the rifle, as there is a small locking grub screw which needs to be removed in order to unscrew this piece. So with the cylinder removed, if we take a look here, we see a small recess in which a grub screw fits into, and this particular grub screw is this one at the front here. That's not fitted on my rifle as we are using the bottle connection. So you would remove the grub screw and then simply unscrew this piece from the front. It does have flats on either side, so you can get a spanner on there and remove it nice and easily. With the bottle or cylinder housing removed, the next thing we'll do is remove the valve and the valve return spring. So to begin with, we'll use a set of tweezers to remove the valve return spring, and then remove the valve from the middle. We can also remove the valve seat, so the small piece of PEEK in the base there, using the Daystate or BRK valve removal tool. And then we can push the tool into the valve and remove the seat. So we have an O-ring round it there, and then the PEEK valve in the end of the tool. Now inside the valve we have two sealing surfaces. So we have this O-ring here, and then the valve face itself, so this piece here. If the valve face is leaking, or this O-ring here are leaking, air will be able to pass through the valve, up the barrel and out the end of it, To fix a leak like this, you would need to replace the O-ring on the back of the valve and possibly also the valve face. This is sold as a spare part from BRK Direct, so if you need one, contact them. I will say at this point as well that this is the sub 12 pound valve, which houses a 4.5mm hole through the middle. There is a 5.1 hole and also a 5.8mm hole through the middle of the valve for the FAC and high power variants, so just be aware of that. The valves also have a corresponding tool for the FAC and high power ones, as well as the sub 12 pound valve. The next thing we'll disassemble is the regulator housing. Before we start on that though, you can see at the front here we have a set of 2 O-rings. If either of these O-rings have failed, air will be able to leak through this thread here and you'll see a leak emanating between the gap of the block and the gap of the regulator housing. So just be aware of that. The next thing we can do is remove this back cap for the valve return spring. That's done by using a set of snap ring pliers, loosening it off, then taking it all the way out. Up next we can remove the Foster fitting at the top here by removing the dust cap and then using a set of snap ring pliers just to loosen these 2 pieces here. Now there is a BRK specific tool to do this job, although you can do it nice and easily with a set of snap ring pliers. To separate these 2 halves here, we are going to have to grip this back section in a vise and then use our snap ring pliers to loosen the top, so I'll do that very quickly off camera. With the pieces loosened, we can simply remove the Foster fitting from the spacer piece. That exposes the one-way valve in the base of the Foster fitting, so just here. To remove this, we need to connect this up to a dive cylinder and momentarily pressurize the unit. This will force a one-way valve out and allow us to service it. Now, you need to be incredibly careful when doing something like this, as obviously this is high pressure air, so we need to be incredibly careful. So we're going to connect it like so, and then put it on a nice solid surface so the one-way valve doesn't turn into a projectile. We're going to open our dive cylinder very, very gently. And that should force the one-way valve out of the end of the Foster fitting. With that done, we can take a look at the 3 seals. So we have 2 Doughty washers, one on the Foster fitting, one on the spacer piece. Then we also have another O-ring. This one is a urethane O-ring on the one-way valve here. If this one is leaking, air will constantly be leaking out the Foster fitting hole. If this one is leaking, or this one is leaking, there'll be a leak emanating from the joints of these 2 components. With that all done, the last thing we can remove from the regulator housing is the regulator itself. Now to do that, I'm going to be using the BRK or Daystate specific tool, pushing that in the regulator there and then unscrewing it. Nice and carefully removing the regulator from the housing. If you didn't have the specific tool, you could also use a set of snap ring pliers. However, I have the tool, so I'm using it. The next thing we'll do is fully disassemble the regulator. To begin with, we'll remove the safety screw from the very top of the unit here by using a 2mm Allen key and just removing the screw entirely. This screw simply stops the adjuster screw, this brass piece here, from being wound out too far whilst the rifles build up. The next thing we'll do is take a flat-bladed screwdriver and remove the adjuster screw. Now the adjuster screw itself does have a small locking grub screw in the top of it, that one there, so if that's wound out too far you may not be able to get your flat bladed screwdriver in there to loosen the adjuster screw, so just be aware of that. That can be removed using a 1.5mm Allen key. The next thing we're going to do is take an M4 bolt, lightly screw that into the base of the piston and then remove the piston along with the white sealing disc, so this piece here. We can take a look at our Belleville stack. And again, this is a sub 12 pound 2.2 rifle, so hopefully you can see the Belleville stack there. The next thing we'll do is discuss the leak points of each of the O-rings in the regulator. To begin with, the regulator adjuster screw, this piece here, we have 2 O-rings. The top one, this one here, if this one has failed, air will be able to leak through these threads here, and you'll feel a constant leak of air emanating from the centre of the reg body. If the bottom one has gone, the bottom one on the regulator adjuster screw, air will be able to pass from the bottle pressure side into the regulated air side, and reg pressure will equal bottle pressure. The same goes for the white sealing disc. If this has failed and needs replacing, air from the bottle pressure side will be able to leak into the regulated pressure side, and your regulator pressure will equal bottle pressure. Next up we have the regulator piston. Now this houses two O-rings, one at the top, one at the bottom. If either of these two O-rings have failed, air will be able to travel through the Belleville chamber, through this bleed hole in the side of the reg body, and then out of the regulator housing through this hole here. So you'll feel a small constant flow of air through this hole. The same goes for these two O-rings here. If either or both of these O-rings have failed, you'll feel a small and constant leak of air through this hole here. Finally, we have the one at the top of the reg body. If this one has failed, you'll feel a small and constant leak of air around this area here. The next thing we'll do is disassemble the air cylinder. Now, both the long and the short air cylinders are constructed in exactly the same way, so we're going to be putting the long air cylinder found on the concept to one side and concentrating on the small air cylinder, the one that's found on the Ranger or the Atomic rifle. Now we've already unscrewed this back piece here, and this back piece here would normally have two O-rings, one around each of these grooves here. If they have failed, air will be able to leak through this thread here, and you'll feel a small and constant leak between the cylinder and the body of the block. With that said, the next thing we'll do is pull this end cap off here. Use a 22mm spanner to remove the gauge. Behind the gauge will be a Doughty washer seal, and if this seal has gone, air will be able to leak through the threads and out of this part here. So just be aware of that. The next thing we'll do is remove the end cap. And if we take a look at this end here, we have two O-rings. If these have failed, air will be able to leak through the threads, and you'll feel a constant leak in this area here. So that's the cylinder fully disassembled. The last thing we'll do is remove the regulator in the back by using an M3 bolt, screwing that lightly into the back of the regulator, and then pulling it out nice and carefully. Like so. Before we disassemble the regulator, we will just very quickly take out the one-way valve in this side of the fill housing. To do that, we're going to use a nice big flat-bladed screwdriver, get it in there nicely, and unscrew the brass filter. With that done, we can tip the brass filter out along with the small washer, and then we have the O-ring or the one-way valve in the base there. To remove this, we would need to install our fill probe and then momentarily pressurize the unit to force the one-way valve out like we did with the Foster fitting. As we've already done that, we're not going to be doing it again, so we're going to be putting these pieces to one side and then concentrating on the regulator. The next thing we're going to do is disassemble the cylinder regulator. Before we start disassembling it though, the first thing we'll do is take a measurement between the top of the adjuster screw here and the top of the regulator body. As this regulator is not externally adjustable, we need to take this measurement here so that when we rebuild the regulator, we can set this to the same distance, and then we should be in roughly the same regulator set pressure as when we took it apart. So on this particular rifle, it's about 2.6mm. So with that noted, we can now remove the adjuster screw by using a flat-bladed screwdriver. Once that's unscrewed, we can gently pull the adjuster screw out from the tip there, and whilst putting our finger over the end, we can use a set of snap ring pliers to remove the snap ring in the base of the regulator, like so. The next thing we'll do is use an M3 bolt, the same M3 bolt we used to remove the regulator from the cylinder, screw that lightly into the piston, then gently pull the piston out. As you do that, just make sure that the white sealing disc doesn't get lost, and then we can take a look at the regulator piston and also the Belleville washer stack. So there that is there. The next thing we'll do is briefly discuss where each of the O-rings lead to if they end up failing. To begin with, we have the one on the end of the adjuster screw, this one here. If this one fails, air will be able to travel from the bottle pressure side of the rifle into the regulated pressure side. So eventually, reg pressure will equal bottle pressure. The same goes for the white sealing disc, this piece here. If this ends up failing, regulator pressure will eventually equalize with the bottle pressure. Next up we have the two on the regulator piston. So both of these ones here, if either of these two O-rings fail, air will be able to travel through the Belleville stack, through this little weep hole here, through the threads, and you'll feel a small and constant leak between the join of the cylinder and the block of the rifle. The same goes for the two on the regulator body. So we have one on the outside here, one on the base here. If either of these two O-rings have gone bad, air will be able to travel through these threads here and around the end of the cylinder here. The last thing we're going to be doing is fully disassembling the main block of the rifle. Now the main block is fairly universal, so it's going to be the same through most of the models, although there are some subtle differences. On rifles that use the AR style butt piece, the hammer spring adjuster, this piece here is slightly different from the one fitted to our rifle. To remove the AR style butt piece from the back of the rifle, we simply need to loosen this nut here, either by using a dedicated tool or by using a punch and simply punching it loose. Then we can unscrew the butt piece from the hammer spring adjuster. This piece would be fixed in the rear of the block like so, but from now on out the disassembly procedure is identical between the two parts, so we'll put this one to one side. The other minor difference between the models is the subtle changes in the trigger. So this one is from an XR Ranger or an XR Atomic, and as you can see, the trigger shape is slightly different. Although the disassembly procedure throughout the triggers is pretty much identical, so to begin with, we're going to be punching out these three pins here using a 2mm punch. Now as you can see here, there are a couple extra holes, so if you're not sure, you can always mark the position of your holes or your trigger pins using a felt tip pen. Then when you come to reassemble your rifle, you know which holes you can use. I, however, know which holes I'm going to be using, so we're just going to be punching the pins out using our punch. As you do so, be nice and careful, as there is a spring behind pretty much all of these sears here. So there's the first one. The second one can be removed in the same way. Again, being nice and careful not to let the spring fly out as you pull the sear out. And then lastly, the one at the back can be removed. This is slightly different from the other ones, as it does have a brass cap in the back which captures the spring, so this piece here. With that done, the next thing we'll do is remove the hammer spring adjuster, and that's done by loosening these two bolts here. Now, as this is a sub 12 pound rifle, we have one anti-tamper bolt and one regular bolt. On FAC rifles and international rifles, these will both be standard Allen headed bolts, although on this rifle one is an anti-tamper. So to begin with, we'll remove the standard bolt using a 3mm Allen key, and then the second bolt can be removed using our 3-pin anti-tamper tool, and then using an 8mm spanner just to loosen that. With those two bolts removed, we can tip the hammer spring adjuster and the hammer spring out from the rear of the rifle. The hammer spring adjuster itself can be further disassembled. If we take a look on the top, we see an Allen headed bolt. If we loosen this using a 2.5mm Allen key, we can remove the hammer spring adjuster from the back. Usually on sub 12 pound rifles, there is a bar travelling through this hole here that prevents your access to the hammer spring adjuster, so on sub 12 pound rifles you would need to remove that using a set of pliers, although on this rifle I've already removed it just to save us a little bit of time. With those parts removed though, we can now remove the hammer from the rear of the rifle. First we need to locate this screw here, and then using a small flat bladed screwdriver we can remove the cheese headed screw. With that removed, the hammer can be slid out the back of the rifle. The hammer could be further disassembled. We have an adjustable stroke in the top here. We can remove this by loosening the locking screw in the side using a 1.5mm Allen key, then coming through with a 2.5mm Allen key to remove the adjustable pip. We're not going to be moving that in this video though, as for the sub 12 pound rifles it's set from the factory. The next thing we can do is remove the cock and dog from the underside of the rifle. So this piece here, we're going to be doing that using a flat bladed screwdriver. Now these are normally done up from the factory very tight and while using Loctite. With it loose we can simply tip the cocking dog out from the bottom of the rifle, and there we have it. The next thing we'll do is remove the cocking arm. To do that, the first thing we'll do is remove the detent, which is this one here. We're going to be doing that using a 2mm Allen key to loosen this grub screw. And then we can gently tap out the small spring and the ball bearing. If it doesn't want to come out straight away, we can just use a small stack of magnets, like so, to remove the spring and the ball bearing. I'll get you a good look at them there, spring and a ball bearing. With those two removed, we can now remove the pivot point, again using a 2mm Allen key in the back here, so this screw right at the back. With that removed, the cocking arm and the pellet probe can be removed from the rear of the rifle, like so. That's pretty much the entire block fully disassembled. With that all said and done, that's the disassembly fully complete. So we're left with a bare block and individual components. In our next video, we'll be taking the bare block and the individual components and rebuilding them into a fully functioning rifle. But that's going to have to wait till next time. So for now, thank you for watching. I hope this video has been useful, and we'll see you in the next one.